A pleasant good evening to everyone. Thank you. My name is Dr. Ochieng Springer, and I am delighted to be chairing our proceedings this evening. We have an intimate setting right now. Most of our audience, I think, is online, but I think this promises to be an exciting lecture. By way of protocol, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Chargé d'Affaires, Mrs. Martha Ortega, Professor Siba Nzachula Grovogi, Professor of Political Science and International Relations, Africana Studies and Research Center, Cornell University, our esteemed speaker, Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal, the University of the West Indies Cave Hill Campus, Deans, Deputy Deans, and Heads of Department, especially our head, Dr. Christina Hines, Head of the Department of Government Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, family and friends of the late Dr. Emmanuel, family and friends of Professor Siba Nzachula Grovogi, members of the UWI community, including alumni, retirees, and students. It would be remiss of me not to specially welcome our former principal, Professor Eudine Barito, specially invited guests, members of the media, our very curious students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight is always an exciting time for the Department of Government Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology as we host our flagship event, the Pat Emmanuel Memorial Lecture, which is in its 19th iteration this year, and it is my pleasure to welcome all those who are here in person and those who are watching us virtually. A quick examination at the back of your programs will indicate some of the topics that were covered in the previous 18 years by some of our esteemed speakers. They capture explorations, critiques, contestations, reimagination, interrogations of some of the most compelling and defining questions of our time. They have done this through the lens of Dr. Pat Emmanuel and through by appreciating his work. And if we think about Dr. Emmanuel, he would have been very relentless in trying to understand the Caribbean condition and in trying to answer questions that we still continue to grapple with as we unpack our condition. So we continue to honor his work, his life, and his memory, and we want, especially for the younger audience, that they're able to understand the importance of his work and the relevance of his work to the current era. In 2022, our Dean, Dr. Troy Lord, in this same setting, would have indicated that the work of Dr. Pat Emmanuel continues to be widely cited and his legacy remains strong. This evening's topic, Spirit Medium on the Hudson, Wisdom, Science, Knowledge, and the Passion of Humanism, promises to be a thought-provoking and reflective one, building on the legacies of excellence established by our previous distinguished speakers. We are in the illustrious company of Baba Siba Nzachula Grovogi, who will deliver this evening's lecture. So once again, I want to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us, and I wish us all an intellectually stimulating evening. At this point, I would like to invite our Deputy Principal, Professor Winston Moore, to deliver the welcome remarks.
A pleasant good night, everyone. I'm going to stand on the already established protocol, but permit me to just say a special good night to the family and friends of the Professor Pat Emmanuel, And we're very happy every year for that you allow us to host this lecture. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this year's Patrick A.M. Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. And I want to begin by thanking each of you for joining us this evening, whether in person or virtually, to celebrate the life and legacy of one of the region's most remarkable academics and to engage in thoughtful dialogue on issues that deeply resonate with our times. These lectures really remind us of what a university is supposed to do. A university is supposed to interrogate issues, have public lectures, engage with the public on issues that are important of the day. And I think the Patrick A.M. Memorial Lecture has done that over the years. If you look through your pamphlet, you'll see a number of really topical lectures by a number of distinguished academics. And I think this year's distinguished academic is no different. We're very happy to have him here this evening to deliver today's lecture. And his research meshes quite nicely with what Patrick Emmanuel would have done, Professor Emmanuel would have done in terms of his research. So I'm very interested to see how you develop tonight's topic and how you could weave together what Patrick Emmanuel would have done in his research and what you have been doing in your research as well. Universities hold a unique and vital place in the Caribbean, and the University of the West Indies is no different. It serves not only as a bastion of higher learning, but also as a catalyst for addressing the region's most pressing challenges. We are a university born out of the dreams of independence and self-determination, entrusted with the responsibility of producing knowledge that empowers our people and nurtures their development. Whenever you hear stories and articles about the University of West Indies, you hear about our high ranking in terms of the Times higher education. But beyond that, the university plays a really important role in terms of educating citizens. And I always tell the story of people like myself who, without the University of West Indies, probably would not be standing here. I know my mother would not have been able to pay for a university overseas, or if there was a university in Barbados, she probably won't be able to pay for a university in Barbados either. So it's the University of West Indies that allow individuals like us to have an opportunity. And University of West Indies is a very special university, not just to us in the Caribbean, but given the research of our colleague academics, has now become a very important place for researchers around the world as well, because our research is not just impacting on the lives of academics and researchers in the Caribbean, it's actually impacting on the lives of researchers around the entire world. So tonight, colleagues, I want you to join me in celebrating one of our most distinguished academics, Patrick Emmanuel, in this very distinguished lecture series. And I'm very much looking forward to how tonight's guest speaker interrogates the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moore, for that warm welcome and for underscoring the value of thoughtful discussion as well as active scholarship. I now wish to invite Mr. Shea Emmanuel, the nephew of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, to give remarks on behalf of the family, and he's going to do so via Zoom.
Good evening, and all protocols observed. It's an honor to participate in the proceedings this evening and to share remarks on behalf of the family on the 19th occasion of the Patrick A.M. Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. We would like to express our gratitude to the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Troy Lord, and to Dr. Christina Hines and her team for organizing this annual event, which recognizes the dear comrade Patrick Emmanuel. We would also like to acknowledge the Grenadian community, friends of the family, academics, and the general public for their continued support and interest. This evening, we look forward to Professor Siba Grovogi's lecture titled Spirit Medium on the Hudson, Wisdom, Science, Knowledge, and the Passion of Humanism. My name is Che Emmanuel, son of Pat's older brother, Jimmy Emmanuel. On behalf of the Emmanuel family, from Bridgetown to St. George's, from Kingston to Toronto, Thank you to the University of the West Indies for your commitment to the legacy of Dr. Emmanuel and for making this lecture series available to a wider international audience. Growing up in Grenada and then St. Lucia, I recall times Uncle Pat spent with us. Uncle Pat lived with my family when he was part of the interim government headed by Nicholas Brafitt in 1984, following the demise of the People's Revolutionary Government. At that time, I was only 5 years old. Dr. Kenny Anthony also invited Uncle Pat to St. Lucia in the mid-90s to conduct a poll of the electorate prior to him becoming Prime Minister. Uncle Pat was a man with a deep moral and social compass. I've come to appreciate Uncle Pat's commitment to the wider Caribbean family. 28 years after his transition, he is still teaching us and bringing us together in community. Beyond our profession, vocations, and studies, we must consider who we are to each other. The ability to commune, to have opportunities like this to share ideas is critical, and to take action to build the Caribbean community envisioned all those years ago, so that we can truly live Morris Bishop's words, we are one people from one Caribbean. Once again, thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Emmanuel family, and I pass it back to Dr. Ocheng Springer.
Thank you, Mr. Shea Emmanuel, for reminding us of Dr. Pat Emmanuel's moral responsibility to the region that continues to live on and that continues to inspire us. I also want to say thank you to the Emmanuel family, especially Mrs. June Emmanuel, for her support and her continued blessing as we continue in our department and at UWI to celebrate the life and the work of Dr. Pat Emmanuel. We always look forward to a brief interlude in our program during this Pat Emmanuel lecture, and this year is no different. We have one of our students, Grace Niles, who is a second-year law student and the constitutional chairperson for the Grenada Student Association at Cave Hill. She is a proud Grenadian and prides herself in service. I now invite Ms. Grace Niles to provide some entertainment.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, that's much better. With protocol already established, good evening again. This poem was written by a local poet, Camille John, so I will just be narrating this evening. It's entitled Roast Breadfruit. I remember when roast breadfruit represented unity, when a coal pot was better than a telephone, and gathered the community, exchanging stories over ashes, fanning the flames, and stoking the laughter, happily ever after. Under moonlit nights, with clear air, clearing the air about any and all politics, bipartisan conversations over roast corn, and the steam rose like voices, climbing over differences of opinion, culminating in a good oil dung, or waters, managed for men who couldn't keep up with their women, who complained about the lack of good men, but happy to hold the hand of their not-so-good men, and children hanging round for some parched corn, poundstone and freezers with jokers and teasers, even as the elders teased of even better days. No, the cell phones have replaced the coal pots, and TV call the shots as shots ring out across the screen. Not a roast corn is seen, except by the side of the road, small and burnt. Paying for them burns a hole in pockets shallow enough to only hold an ego. No space for feelings or stories or any type of unity. And children are children no more. No longer pound stone, pounding games without shame, speaking to each other through fiber optics, observing the politics of teasing relentlessly, whether heartlessly or sexually. Young boys, trying to be grown men, desperate to grab at the innocence of the almost big women, whose eyes water when they dream of fish, creating a broth of frustration and anger, which rekindle the embers of unhappiness. And I look for the moonlit nights, but the street lights are too bright. Can someone please stop tease and take me back to days of my roots, to the days of roast breadfruit? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Niles, for that thought-provoking piece that offered a moment of reflection. We have now reached the highlight of our evening, the time to hear from our esteemed speaker. I will now invite our head of department, Dr. Hines, to come and introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I am not going to say protocols haven't been established, because I'm told I shouldn't do that. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, Professor Siba Zatula Grovogi, Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal, the University of the West Indies Cave Hill Campus, Deans, Deputy Deans, Heads of Departments of the UWI, family and friends of the late Dr. Patrick A.M. Emmanuel, Mrs. June Emmanuel, Dr. Kwame Emmanuel, son of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, who is joining us online, I believe, Dr. Maisha Emmanuel, niece of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, and just her this time. I would also like to welcome, although not on my protocol list, Senator Dr. Crystal Drakes, family and friends of Professor Siba Zatula Grovogi, members of the UWI community, including alumni, retirees, and students, specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Siba Zatula Grovogi. He told me to call him Baba Siba. So welcome, Baba Siba. I hope you feel very welcomed. So I do have an extensive biography here, and it does not cover everything that I could say to introduce Baba Siba. Prof. Siba, we've been calling him, so that it's easier for all of us here. I met Prof. Siba, Baba Siba, in 2018. He probably does not remember this. And this was on the occasion of him winning the Distinguished Scholar of the Global South Caucus of the International Studies Association. That was in 2018. And I remember that he delivered remarks. And what I remember about those remarks is that they were very kind. They were very kind, they were very humble, and they were not like some of the remarks we had heard in previous years. Very different. And I thought this was an interesting person. I will now revert to the actual biography. Our featured speaker is Professor of International Relations, Law, and Theory at the Africana Studies and Research Center, Cornell University, New York. his intellectual journey of excellence began in Conakry, Guinea, with his undergraduate degrees culminating in his master's and PhD at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, in political science. His teaching and research interests are in the thematic areas of international and global politics that highlight dimensions applicable to African contributions and elucidation on the central themes of global politics: international community, sovereign rights, global justice, and moral subjectivity. Sounds interesting, right? My students have been exposed to some of this thought, and they're here today to hear it live and direct. We teach this in our theories of international politics, so students, you are having an absolute treat today. His work involves critical examination of politics and political thought, considering the advances in historiography, ethnography, and hermeneutics, with disciplinary interlocking interests in several philosophical, literary, artistic, or political traditions associated with the African past and present. He is author of numerous journal articles and notably 3 books: Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Memories of International Order and Institutions, Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans, Race and Self-Determination in International Law. And he has co-authored with Laurie Leonard, Governance in the Extractive Industries, Power, Cultural Politics, and Regulation. He is also President-elect of the International Studies Association. He will take office in 2025. There are so many things that are not on this biography. When we had lunch yesterday, Baba Siba told me that he was a lawyer at one point. He was a judge as well in Guinea. This is his 3rd career, he informed us. He also wanted to study in a seminary. He wanted to be a priest. So this is a very interesting person that we have with us. We had a delightful time yesterday, and I am very happy to have you here with us. Welcome, Professor.
Good evening. All protocols observed. I don't know people's names, so I don't want to step on anybody's toe. But I was telling Professor Hines that I give a lot of talks, but everywhere I go, the environment does something to me. And I had not expected to have Mrs. Emmanuel here tonight. I'm very delighted that she's here. I want to say, and this part was unscripted because I didn't know this moment would come, that when I was in grad school, I went to grad school in 1984, one of the first moments that I knew that our international system deserved the attention of Black people was, in fact, what was referred to earlier as the demise of the revolution in Grenada, when Maurice Bishop was deposed. That and the independence of Namibia, which is the subject of my first book, and the anti-apartheid movement guided me through grad school. I went to grad school as an adult, grown up, not somebody who just went from college to grad school. So I was already politically a bit engaged. And I decided then that I was going to go to grad school, be a professor, and write 3 books. The first one was the one that was about Namibia's independence. And the second one, Beyond Eurocentrism, is actually about 4 African scholars, diplomats, in France after World War II, and what they thought the world should be. And I'm saying this because I actually have great reverence for our diplomats, people on the world stage, like Mr. Emmanuel, Dr. Emmanuel, who have, I think, received a sleight of hand, and not just from those people to whom they speak in international forums, but by ourselves. And so I decided to work on 3 books, and the last one was this one. I actually joked with people always that it was my Black people's book. That Black people's book became 2 books because I needed to write one book that people had to read so they can actually leave me alone when they read the Black people's book. They don't have to ask too many questions. And that book, I was telling Professor Hine that it's an 800-page book, and it's called The Gaze of Copernicus. And it has to do with this moment of crisis in the international system, a crisis of law, morality, ethics, institutions. Everything to be breaking down. And I was no longer content to accept the idea that we wait until the revolution to decide what to do. And so I wanted to write about how Black people have seen the world in the modern era. And I was going to write a book. That's the book I'm writing now, because the companion book is already with the publisher. And this book begins in 1605 in Palmares, which is where the first attempt of making a republic in the New World happened, 200 years before America has its own republic. Columbus in Palmares established a republic that lasted longer than the Soviet Union. Longer than the Soviet Union. And yet we tell ourselves today that America is the first republic on this continent, the US. And I didn't decide to write about it because of a Me Tooism. It's not simply that Black people did it. It is that the texture, the constitution, the composition of the idea of a republic in Palmares are far more interesting than any idea that has come since. And I maintain that that's why I started to write this book. And so I'm making the trajectory of Black people's relation to the international system and its institutions and laws and ethics and regimes of morality, from Palmares to Haiti, to the Maroons, to anti-colonialism, to the civil rights movement in America, and to Nelson Mandela's Rivonia speech. I think they contend together ideas and vision of what this world can be. And I was no longer content to be a critique. I don't want to critique what people are doing anymore. I think critique is a compliment in some fashion, and I'm no longer interested in complimenting what is clearly the international system that is clearly has become a dystopia for all of us. And then people who read the manuscript told me that I cannot stop in 1963. I have to actualize what I'm doing. And so I heard the speech by your Prime Minister at the United Nations responding to Netanyahu, and that I was working on before Professor Christina Hines called me. And I had to say that I will come. This is the last chapter of my book, and it's not a political endorsement. I have to say that protocol. It's not. But it is because I wanted to actually bring my ideas to the current moment, and that speech seemed to have been the God sent to me. So I was actually working on it before you invited me, and I had to say that. And so this part, so my speech today is actually mostly directed at our young people here to know how we do science. The social sciences were born as instruments on behalf of a social project. That is not our own. If you're in political science in America, you go to a classroom, you are told this is political theory, and they teach you Europeans. This is comparative politics, the models are Europe. But what is more important for me as an international relations scholar is that international relations as an instrument wants me to believe that violence done to me was natural. It was what people do. Because we live in a state of nature, there is hierarchy. There's anarchy, and hierarchy, and therefore. So to you all, I want to say that we don't have to accept that narrative because it's not actually true. And so I decided that for this book, this moment at United Nations between Prime Minister Motley, I'm just going to say Motley after this, protocol observed, but I'm just going to say that because I'm a scholar, I go by last names, and that's what it's going to be. And Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, had this thing going, tit for tat, where Netanyahu basically was quoting from the Bible to justify what was happening in Gaza and Lebanon and etc. And I believe that he quoted the book of Samuel, where he said that Israel, as if people had wished Israel to disappear, which nobody actually does, but that Israel shall not perish, etc. And of course, the Prime Minister, Motley, went to another biblical citation to say that revenge is not ours, it's the Lord's. When people like Motley do that, and our ambassadors, past and present, when they go to these places and talk, people can only imagine as people who are impassioned. This is just about passion. There's no science, there's no whatever. It's the moment, and they must be upset and etc. Of course it's not true. Which is why I'm actually writing my book, because there are centuries of thought that go through those fleeting moments of utterances. What we don't know is how the body, our experiences, our life circumstances, both teach us about life, and how messages before us and people before us, we carry them within us as time goes on. So we actually have to say for ourselves what archives, what canons, what all those things are, because they are comfortable citing Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and etc., and they imagine that we don't have those. How knowledge is carried is actually why I was writing the first book, to say that in fact, these people belong to traditions, and those traditions are very deep. And they go deep, they are ingrained in very sort of, not only they have archival basis, foundation, etc., there's canonical thought behind them. And our job as scholars of African descent is to make exactly what other people do, to abstract those, to see what they connect to in order to give them systematicity. We have to systematize what we think ourselves for ourselves to make it valid, so that when we defend them, we actually are not simply being on the defensive, that we are making particular kind of argument. And so one of the ways in which I imagined that we embody and carry these ideas was to imagine the spirit medium, which is why I say spirit medium on the Hudson. I was actually referring to Motley on the Hudson River in the United Nations, and what a spirit medium is. I like the figure of spirit medium because it does something for us in our conceit in sciences to think that there is something called objectivity and something called subjectivity. You have subjective, you have objective. But none of us can live without their own attachment, their own values, their own background, and etc., etc. So that distinction to me has always sounded to be fallacious. What a spirit medium does is actually do multiple things for me as a scholar in this book I'm writing, how I'm imagining how we function in this world. What the spirit medium does is connect us to the past, right? But also commit themselves, because the spirit medium works on two levels. One, the message, the medium, and two, actually three. Two, the connections to the past, our ancestors. And I use the term spirit medium because the person I'm quoting here did refer to African proverbs and the ancestors, and how we carry our ancestors is actually the figure of the spirit medium. And what the spirit medium does is to connect the subjective and the objective. Because if you are referring to something, the ancestors, you are referring to traditions, you are also referring to certain values. And those values we can never do without them. And so I want to get out of this idea that there's something called objectivity somewhere there and something called subjectivity, and that we operate at some level and other people operate at the level of science and etc. And I use the spirit model in that sense to actually do multiple things. One of them is to contrast traditions from which Netanyahu and Motley may come from, and why in many ways hers is the one where we find salvation. And when I say hers, since I'm talking about our ancestors, it's the communal, hers here is communal, right? It's not that particular person, it's not that particular utterance, because I'm linking it to many things. So again, this is not a political endorsement, I have to be clear, right? This is about what is embedded in the message itself, right? Netanyahu comes from a tradition which political scientists have called realism, right? And given his connection to America, obviously, that tradition is what tells people that we live in an anarchical world, that there is something called state of nature, and there is something called human nature. And between the three of them, they imagine that we are condemned to pursuing something they imagine to be interest in a particular way. And in the pursuit of interest, it's a combat of all against all. Whoever can get to the top will get to the top. There is, in that science, and since I have young people here, I want to simplify it for young people here, there is this idea that there is, anthropologically, we have something we call needs and desires. And they read them in a particular way, and those needs and desires express themselves in a particular way, such that humans are condemned to want to be on top. And they imagine that to be a good thing. They also imagine that taking from other people should be all right. In fact, they didn't stop there, historically. They gave us doctrines of discovery. They gave us extraterritoriality. And they even allowed that you can take other people, other human beings, and make them work for you. Enslavement. All of that, so the theory is to make us comfortable with certain ways of being in the world, certain modes of action, certain foreign policies, in which violating other people can be almost acceptable. Because if this is natural, then we must forgive those who are it, because they imagine that if we were in their place, we would do exactly the same thing. Right? Of course, if you are young and curious, there's a simple question that should come to mind always. If you take South Africa, those 30 white folks who were grounded in the Cape of Good Hope, if the black people they found there believed like as they did, would they have survived? Christopher Columbus? No. Human disposition actually is far more, the ranges of human disposition is far broader than realists allow. And yes, in space and time, different people weave together how they respond to things based on those sentiments, sensibilities, and etc. They weave them together to come with different responses. And so we are not condemned to act that way, but in political science department, in political realism, we are told that we should act that way. And if you act that way, then something must be wrong with you. And to go back to the book that I was writing, obviously, I want to tell you that I've said to young people here that disciplines were called from their inception instrument. That their instrument is actually should be taken very, very seriously. Every discipline we have today came about at a particular point for a particular purpose. Political theory, after Jonestown was occupied. Political economics, after the British India conquered India. You can actually carbon date how these disciplines came. So how they have woven woven how humans should function, what is anticipated of human, is actually quite distorted for our point of view. For them, it's natural because they were on top, right? And because they were on top, they have to make what has happened historically acceptable and palatable. And we have to live with these so-called sciences. Obviously, on the face of it, given what the world is today, even after World War II, well, including World War I and World War II too, and what we have today, we actually know that political realism, as pragmatic as people said it was going to be, we know today from the outcome, the multiplicity of wars and the outcome of foreign policies from those countries that give us political realism, that wisdom does not figure in it. Wisdom is the one thing that does not figure in it. Morality also not. And so, I'm going to wrap up. And so, what Motley was saying in response to Netanyahu was actually, again, far more nebulous because we don't imagine it to be precise. The idea that wars, no matter how angry, how bad the protagonist, wars must come to an end. And there's an implicit question that one raises, that one asked from that statement that wars must come to an end, is if war must come to an end, why do we fight them in the first place? Why do we fight wars in the first place? Why not diplomacy? Diplomacy is also a science that Europeans took from the Persians and then the Ottomans and decided that diplomacy has to be an extension of war. Or they say, war is politics by other means. But that's not how what diplomacy was meant to be. Historically, that's not what diplomacy is about, actually. Diplomacy, from where it arose, in the place where it arose, diplomacy generally is actually much more complicated. But without giving you the entire trajectory of diplomatic thought before European hegemony, I can tell you that it has certain dimensions. One of them is surprises. One of them is acceptability. One of them is being conversant in things that you didn't know. One of them is that interests are co-constituted. That idea of diplomacy has given us also commonplaces we often forget. Again, I'm reminded, since I'm in political science, that every political science department I've been to will tell me about Kant, cosmopolitanism. I'm sure you have all read Kant. No disrespect to Kant. He's a genius with a very, very space-time vision limited to his own circumstances. But every time somebody tells you that there isn't an idea of cosmopolitanism we gain from Kant, ask them if they know about Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam is a cosmopolitan space. It existed long before Kant, and how it came about, we have to ask, how did Africans who met Arabs and Muslims on their coast, how did they manage to create with them spaces that are very tolerant, multiple, plural, conversant, and etc., etc. We have a Dar es Salaam. Nobody has to tell us about cosmopolitanism. Kant's cosmopolitanism pales before everything we have done, every regimes of morality we have developed in our own spaces. I'll give you an example. In the world today, people who read Kant at least, imagine Kant to be a step further from what we call the golden rules. Treat others as you wish to be treated. And Kant says, yeah, we have to treat others as we wish to be treated, but it has to be, you have to have principles behind it. And so for students who are here, not our guests obviously, you have to go through this about categorical imperative, critique of pure reason, blah, 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 and all that stuff, right? But the essential part the essential part is that we have to find predicate to justify what should come to people naturally, that you should be able to realize that treating other people as you wish to be treated is how the world should go. All right? Again, since I'm talking to students in the back there, cryptically speaking, Gandhi did something more interesting. Mahatma Gandhi he did something more interesting. He said, all of these, treat others as whatever, just be the change that you want to see. So if everybody wants to live like the change they want to see, then that will be interesting. That's actually the world in which we live. Of all the moral and ethical principles in the world today, there is not one that is harder, but that is the last one left standing to save us, is the one from Nelson Mandela. This is why we have to read our diplomats, our leaders, carefully. Everybody calls, "I'm prepared to die" speech. What is in a prepared to die speech? It's not just an old man being kind to people who imprisoned him. He said, "I have fought against white supremacy. I have fought against white domination. I have fought against black domination." First of all, he does not imagine that those two dominations are the same. One is political economic supremacy, and the other one from black people is the risk of majoritarianism, that white people will be in a permanent minority. He didn't want that. But this is not the most important part. The most important part, he said, is that it is a principle for which he's willing to live. It's also one for which he's willing to die if need be. In effect, Mandela is saying, not that you should live the change that you want to see, not that you should treat other people like you wish to be treated, right? Not as you should do it because it's morally wrong or right, or whatever, but that if something is dear to you, so dear to you that you are willing to die for, you should imagine that somebody else might be willing to die for it. And so you should be willing to die to give other people that for which you are willing to die to give to yourself. That's a much harder ethical principle, but it's the only one we have left, to my estimation. And so when Motley says, people fight wars, but wars must end, she's basically saying that as humans, everything that incites other people to want to fight war should incite anybody else to want war. If Israel believes in safe, blah, 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 borders, safety, whatever, they should be willing to imagine that Palestinians would want it too. Why fight a war if the principle is already understood? On the street of Côte d'Ivoire in Abidjan, we said that people cannot fight over $1,000, 1,000 francs, I'm sorry, not dollars. People cannot fight under 100 francs unless somebody wants 501 for themselves. Then you start a fight. Otherwise, it's 500, right? But it's not a joke, actually. It is that we should understand why people fight wars and etc. But realism, the Netanyahu and the American administration basically have conjured up this idea at this moment where everybody would attack this little country in the Middle East called Israel, because there's something called anti-Semitism, because. And so because this little country cannot know what future lays ahead, it then has to have, which is what the American doctrine is, that it has to have the technological edge in military in defense. So it must perpetually have the edge militarily. Who said that Iran doesn't have to have the edge? Right? And so realism, in its pragmatism, obviously want a future that is safe, and therefore want to prepare for a future that is unknown. We don't know the future. I don't think Motley believes that we know the future either. What I know, however, is that there is actually science and systematicity in the way that she's approaching this. And Netanyahu's is actually what awaits us. That's where dooms lie. And so basically, if you want to imagine the future, right, we can only do it through suppositions. We can only do hypotheses and etc. But we can also do it actually through what we know, the science of what we know. What we know can tell us what is to be known. There's no guarantee that what we know will give us what we expect tomorrow, but at least we know what to do when we get to tomorrow. And so, in astronomy, in the sciences, you have these two models of gravitational forces. One is the black hole, and one is the wormhole. Black holes consume everything that goes into them, including light, because of how gravitational forces operate in black holes, and how its constituted, how its particles are constituted, and etc. We know, everybody knows that, physicists actually know that at the end of the black hole, there should be something. We don't know whether there should be something. What we know is that if we go through a black hole, everything gets consumed. War, to me, is what it is. We know that the passion that leads us to war only consumes us. Any passion that leads somebody to war, to want to have war, will consume somebody else. If war starts, nobody wins a war. Nobody wins a war. Nobody at the end of realism comes out happy. We are still talking today about the reparation after enslavement and etc., and people think that we are sort of cranky bunch, a cranky bunch. But that's because the kind of pragmatism that the West gave us from the 17th century onward is untenable. We can't keep fighting wars. We can't keep thinking that we can always have the edge in warfare. What about when we lose it? Right? The fact is that you know that they don't believe themselves, their own pragmatism, because they have nuclear weapons. Iran wants nuclear weapons. They say, no, Iran cannot have it. But you have it. If you think that that makes you safe, let them have it. Nothing, no logic. There's no logic to it. There's no consistency. There's nothing. And so what else do we have to hang on to? It is actually that old kind of diplomacy diplomats have been working toward. What it gives us is like a wormhole, which is the contrast to black holes. It is messy. Physicists also know that at the end of wormholes, there ought to be something there. We don't know what it is, but the difference between diplomacy and war is that if we know how to hold one another together, how to be conversant, how to understand one another, how to know that we die for things that other people also want to die for. If you know how to translate, if you know how to converse, then once we go through the messiness of all our conflicts and contentions, at least we'll know how to talk to one another. We'll know how to be receptive to one another. We may not agree, but we'll know. We'll know what language of power is to each one of us. We'll know what the language of interest is. We'll know how to translate among ourselves. We can get somewhere. That is how the international system originated. The international system did not originate from states, as you are taught in your schools. It's not the state system, it's none of those. Going back to Africa, for 8 centuries, you could leave what is now northern Mozambique and end up in China. You spoke not anybody's language. There was no currency that people shared. You didn't have ID cards. You had none of those, but people did it. How did they do it? What we now call diplomacy. I want to end on that on one note. You all hear serendipity. You know where serendipity come from as a word? It's come from that old world of the Persians we call diplomacy today. Serendipity as a word come from a British man called Walpole, who in the 18th century, 1748, ends up in a place called Serendib, where Sri Lanka is now today. Sri Lanka actually is Serendip in Persian. And he saw people, Chinese, Hindus, everybody, nationalities, religions, etc., cohabitating on this island. And it was so marvelous to him that he wrote to his brother back home in the UK and said, I have seen something I have never seen in the West. I cannot imagine the West. People just floating, frolicking together, doing all these things. And he said, it has to have its own name. And since the island is called Serendipo, I'm going to call it serendipity. And so we call serendipity, we now have the word serendipity as happy happenstance, but it was because it was a world that Europe could not imagine. That old world where people came together, not contemptuous of one another, but knowing what one another need, knowing that we have a common faith, no sovereign, no superior language, no superior means, no pretense that anybody is better than another, is what gave us serendipity before European hegemony. Europe has managed to distort not only war and its purpose, diplomacy and its purpose, morality and its purpose, ethics and its purpose. We have to regain it. And the counter-models to all of those reside in our moral universe here among black people, which is why I start my story with Palmares in 1605 and end up now in current association with the speech that Martley gave. We have no other choice. We cannot be judge, legislator, adjudicator at the same time. We cannot be the ones to decide. We cannot do revenge. We can't do that. The world is broken. The world is broken. The world is broken, which is why when Martley said that the world needs a reset, one should take it seriously. That reset will not be done on the terms of those people who gave us the dystopia in which we live. That reset, the resources, mental, intellectual, and the sensibilities that go with the great reset has to come from the work that we do to put forth, to systematize, to give archives, to construct our own canons about what the world needs to look like and present it in those places so that we don't go always having to protest or to make a feeble attempt to correct other people. They have to know that the world that they have constructed is not how the world lived. This is not how the world lived. It is somebody's understanding of the world. Their universals are their own. Their system of morality are their own. They are other competing ones. The world existed before them. Cosmopolitanism existed, Dar es Salaam. People moved from Mozambique to China and back. The Strait of Malacca existed long before Portugal took over in 1511. We have the resources to make the world better. And but we cannot get there if we don't take ourselves seriously, if we don't find in what we say to one another and to other people connections, deep archives, traditions that are worth teaching to the world. Thank you very much. That's where I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for a very erudite and profound presentation as you delved into the realm of ideas. I think for me, I appreciated the fact that you called on us to re-examine the moral and political and intellectual foundations of the international system, and you also maybe encouraged us to unpack existing genealogies as we think about who we are and what we want to be. And I think you also touched on the fact that we have a responsibility to do this for ourselves and for others. So thank you again for that. At this point in time, we will allow you to engage with our audience So we will take a couple rounds of questions. So I will invite persons that have questions to just indicate. And if you have a question, if you're joining us from the online platform and you have a question, you can also type your question in the chat and you will get a chance to get a response from Prof. Oh, after Dawn.
Good night, everyone, and thank you very much for that inspiring, much needed intellectual nourishment. And let me also say to Professor Barto, I anticipated that we will be probably the earliest ones to put our hands up. Okay, so I want to ask you, there's so much things I want to say, but I'll ask you one question and move the mic along, and if, in case we're stuck, I'm ready to come back. Now, the first question I'm going to ask you, based on your overall critique of the current world order, because ultimately that's what you're also doing, and noting that we are in a crisis of U.S. global leadership and all that that entails, the absence of morality, et cetera, and we can go on there. What are your views about that whole literature that speaks of the decline of the American empire and the need for the void, this is in international relations literature, the need for the void to be filled with other contending visions of a world order? What are your views about that literature, about the decline of the American empire? And how do what movements would you point to? What new current and energizing ideas that you see on the horizon, whether it's coming from within the global south or non-state actors, reparations movement, climate change, climate justice? What are the current ideas that you're seeing congealing in this moment that could pose a counter to the prevailing world order?
Thank you. Thank you. You see, when I was talking about diplomacy sui generis, I was intimating that I don't know, and I don't want to know because I don't want to be authoritarian. I don't want to give a rule. That is one of the problems we have. But I can tell you that Americans are the only people who don't know that the decline has started a long time ago. The Genocide Convention, America didn't sign it until 40 years later. They did not. In the 1970s, in the 1980s, there was a black man who was director of UNESCO, Matambo. Matambo was the one who was there when they did they proposed the international communication reform, and then they did the universal heritage fund site to fund them, and etc., etc. And the Europeans and the US thought that this guy wanted to subvert their own authority in the world. Now, UNESCO has one quality that other organs in the UN don't have. Like, the General Assembly has a Security Council, the UN has Security Council, General Assembly, blah. UNESCO is a bunch of scholars, right? The US and Britain, under Thatcher and Reagan, decided that they didn't like this man, and they wanted to resign. He did not resign, one. The US and Britain left UNESCO. 20 years later, they came back without anybody inviting them. A young woman in her cabin in Vermont was the one who was behind the landmine campaign. One person, single woman in a barely heated cabin in Vermont. we all have stuff to contribute. And I think it's actually to our detriment that we always have to go back to these hierarchies, to the sovereign state system, to international organizations, etc., as if ideas, that's not how ideas circulate. Ideas come from all corners, right? But what I know is that, to use an expression favored by a friend of mine, the best hymns of freedom come from black people. We have a lot to teach, actually. It's just a matter for us to systematize them to know where they come from. Haitians, at the time of the revolution, did not have the likes of the Jeffersons and Madisons and etc., etc., but they knew what freedom was. You know what else? The Haitian revolution still today is unparalleled in the manner in which it understood human rights. The American gave us individual rights. The individual does not exhaust what the human is. The French gave us citizenship right. It doesn't exhaust that. If you want to understand the human condition, you go to the Haitian Constitution. It's far more interesting. And these people were not men of the Enlightenment, as we say today. There's much that comes from the human experience and sensibility, and there's much that occurs to all of us as insight. Now, what scientists do, what these young people in the back here have to do, is to take those insights back to those connections and etc. that give us what other people call canons, right? So that if you say this thing and they say this idea came from this moment in Grenada, as we'll say, Augsburg, 1555. Why not Grenada? Why not Barbados? What happened in Barbados, we don't know. Because we are still chasing this thing, we think that interesting things only happen in New York. No. Far from it. Far, far from it. Haiti is far more interesting than the French Revolution. For sure. For sure. This is not just because I like to send the virtue, but because it's a fact. Right? So I don't think that we want to wait for one person to come to deliver all of us. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad have come and gone. We only have ourselves now. The prophets are gone. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Professor Barito.
Professor Sieber, I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. I found it riveting, and I'm so glad there are students here because I particularly enjoyed and heard you speak to the containment of the Eurocentricity of what passes for political thought. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but the fact that it is so hegemonic. And as I listen to you, I wish you would go more into the Africana contribution to political philosophy. And as I listened to you, I thought how excellent it would be to be followed by a Professor Ochieng Odiambo, who specializes in African philosophy and is actually a dean of the Faculty of Humanity and Education here. And so for me, I would have loved more of that, not only for myself, because I'm aware of it, but also for the students, because too many of our students, the responsibility on faculty to expand the understanding of the world, north, south, east, and west, and not because of geopolitics where we are located. The assumption, as you say, of the focus on New York and the difficulty of getting scholars who prioritize Africana thought. But I have a question for you because you juxtaposed the realist view of politics, say, as practiced by Netanyahu, and diplomacy. And I thought that in that, you homogenize diplomacy, because you can have diplomacy as practiced by Henry Kissinger, which in its fact was an extension of war, diplomacy as war. So when you were speaking to a particularly kind of diplomacy, but I thought that in that you homogenized the idea of diplomacy. So I would like you to complicate it, especially on behalf, again, of the students, to understand that you can have diplomacy, that every act of that diplomat or particular school of diplomacy is an extension of war and an extension of hegemony. But thank you very much. It was very, very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your generous, kind words, for your generous comment. I want to start with diplomacy, and then I'll go to the first point. I said spirit medium. The spirit medium is a diplomat of sort. I said diplomat sui generis, actually. I added the word sui generis, as it comes. It is far more complicated, right? I talk about spirit medium to actually say that we have to democratize diplomacy itself. One is not a good diplomat because one is Henry Kissinger from America, and one is not less credible as a spokesperson for humanity because you are from Barbados. It is not. It is in the content of what is said. It is in the constitution, in the fiber of what is said. It is in the ingredient of what that contains, and it is its applicability to the solutions that we have before us that actually ought to give us, that ought to qualify what we should rely on. So it's not necessarily big, small, white, black, and etc. When I was talking about Dar es Salaam, in the Indian Ocean, Swahili Coast, all of these places that came, people had to negotiate. Dar es Salaam is a function not only of people's kindness, but the monsoon, because when people came, they were stuck for 6 months because you cannot go against the monsoon, and etc. So you had to negotiate your relationship with these people you met. So the negotiation was not just about merchandise and etc. It was about lifestyle. It was about customs. It was about the price of things. It was about where I fix my boat, and etc. etc. That is so by necessity. And so diplomacy comes not only through entreaties. You know, I meet somebody and I say, well, I like you, like me, let's do this, and etc. Sometimes people are constrained. That is also diplomacy. In the Sahel, you know, one of the things we have today in Mali, for those people who are interested, because the current conflict of Mali, I actually wrote an essay called Your Blues and My Blues, 7 years before the current civil wars in Niger, Mali, and Burkina. And I said the day, 7 years before it happened, that the day the Americans come to the anti-terrorism, there will be civil war in those places. Because life there did not accommodate the kind of things, policies we have. One of the most ridiculous things I've seen about Mali is for a bunch of people in Spain telling them, you know, we have this thing here we call Tribunal of Waters. You need to manage your resources, and we can come teach you. You know who brought the Tribunal of Waters to Spain? The Moors. You know where the Moors got it? How you manage the Wadi. These people in the Sahel discovered that everybody is subject to the vagaries of the Sahel. The sand dune moves, and so your wadis can be, the water can be here today, it can be elsewhere tomorrow. So certain resources like water are not subject to sovereign claims. Everybody goes to water where it is. People have managed to have those kind of talks among themselves, treaties, and it was not, sometimes it was formal society, formal authorities, sometimes it was just people figuring it out. So diplomacy, I'm not really getting into sovereign state system either, right? But I also don't want the hierarchies. That's what I want to break down, which is why I'm talking about the spirit medium on the Hudson, about somebody who come from a place called Barbados, but who can actually see something that other people, all these big people, China, blah, blah, they can all sit there and can't understand it. But I want to give it content so they actually know how profound the thought was, even it was brief, and it came from somebody from an island people only go to visit when they are on whatever, cruise boat or cruise ship or whatever. Right? So we have to take ourselves seriously and to know that it's upon all of us to heal this world. But where the interesting ideas come from, we don't know. You cannot anticipate, and therefore I cannot give you a solution. Now, about the Afrikaners' ideas. You know, when I was talking about Matambo, I'm actually writing an essay, Matambo. Matambo is Senegalese. He's Fulani. He just died a few months ago at the age of 103. Right? He's also Tijani. The Tijanis are people who inherited from the heirs to the people, the Moors who went and conquered Spain. You can make a lineage between the Abbasid Empire, the collapse of the Abbasid Empire, the Andalusian experiment, and what happened in Timbuktu. It's not a surprise that the Europeans discovered the Greeks through Africans. From Diogenes, the philosopher onward, 8 centuries, every single Greek philosopher lived in Africa. I did not say visit, lived. Pythagoras, all of them. When did Pythagoras get geometry? From the pyramids. They all lived there. This is not whatever, right? They were in conversation with us. None of them went to Sweden. With all due respect to the good Swedes. But the good Swedes tell me that Aristotle and Plato are their tradition, but they are not mine. They were in conversation with me. Political thought in Africa goes deep, deep, deep. The first Christian saint, St. Augustine, is an African. The man on the scene of the crucifixion who did not spit at Jesus, who helped him carry his cross, was Simon of Cyrene, Cyrenaica, Africa. Africa has been connected to every religious system. Moses' wife, Zipporah, is Canaanite from where Sudan is now. All of them. Africa has never been detached from all those movements. The fact is that not only have we been part of the philosophical religious movement as they emerge, but our hymns have been far more melodious than we realize today. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Any other questions? From our
I brought this talk to your level, but in the back here, I wanted you to actually be curious and ask me questions. I'm not going to leave you until I hear from a student, for sure.
While we wait on the students to think about their questions, Prof, can I ask you what inspired the books that you're writing?
I'll just go to be what I said. I was not lying when I said the Bishop case, Southwest Africa, about my first book is, and the anti-apartheid movement are really what inspired me, and I wanted to write 3 books. One, about international law and what it did to our people. 2, about how we saw freedom, and I focus on post-war era on these 3 African scholars, Dabussier, Ouezem Coulibaly, and a man called Boubou Ama, right, in the French Empire. Obviously, they were connected to Aimé Césaire and all of these other people. And then the other one was that we have to be able to say what we have said to the world. And that's what this book was about. And I wanted to say what we have said to the world about the Republic, Palmares, human rights, Haiti, freedom, the Maroons, anti-colonialism, the anti-colonial movement, ethics and morality, the anti-apartheid movement. I want, and each rubric takes me to one part of the black world, one moment in history, to see how we imagine all of these and to show all the connections between here and Africa and back. Right? Because we are more, in this space, we are more connected to those things, but we don't even know where these ideas come from. Right? So Haiti, which is what Rolf Trujillo's book was about, the fact that the people who actually met in Bois Caiman and decided on the revolution had first come from Africa. These people came from Africa where we had empires. Freedom was not new to them, right? But their articulation in the New World is somewhat different because they had all left Africa. They found themselves in in what is now northwestern Brazil, northeastern Brazil, and then had to remake themselves, right? Diaspora, that's what diasporic formation is. Diaspora always begins with dispersal, and then people have to, it's always dispersal, survival, reconstitution, right? And self-making. But you don't leave anything behind, even if you go through all of those phases. And the thing about diaspora, actually, and that's, I'm in Afrikaner, so when I talk about diaspora, I tell them Africa itself, the whole continent is diaspora. Kenya, Mombasa. We in Africa learn to conceptualize Africa as a place through people who left Africa. It's the Caribbean, these islands, that gave us Pan-Africanism. Among us, before them, we were Kenya, this and that and the other, or at least in those times, ethnic group, Kikuyu, Luo, blah, 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 etc. It's them here who said we all come from this place, and the fact that they were stripped of names, identity, and etc., just gave them the one place they could, the one object they had for sure that they could relate to was a continent. They actually helps us in Africa reimagine Africa. We are all connected in ways, and these ideas circulate, these motions circulate, these sort of sensibilities circulate, and we don't know them. Other people tell us they have traditions that go back to the Greeks. And of course, we are supposed to imagine that we have no such traditions. It's all in the present, in the now, in the today. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question at the front here.
Good evening, and thank you for a very enlightening and educational presentation. But you said something that struck out at me. What are the implications of international law, and what has it done to our people? Can you point out about three aspects or so?
The way I think about international law is twofold. One is that there is a legacy of what after 1785 European called international law, which comes from Jus Gentilis and etc. That tradition has a legacy behind it of violence, of dispossession, of discovery, doctrine of discovery, of enslavement, of what is it? Pontifex Romulus and all of these papal doctrines and etc. that basically made us, less than human and available to blah, blah, blah. And our relationship sense to the global economy, no matter where you were, in Africa, here, elsewhere, black people, on the scale, on the hierarchy of things, were always available for our resources, and etc. So that is a legacy we have to live with. But international law is our common inheritance. People everywhere have imagined how to relate with other people and through what terms, right? I just gave a paper in Dar es Salaam called Terra Inhabitata, which is the opposite of Terra Nullius, about Ibn Battuta's travel from Africa, throughout Africa, to Arabia, all the way to China, looking for how Islamic jurisprudence was translated everywhere. And the reason I'm tracing him is to show that everywhere, so this idea of, commercial societies, cultural mixing, even languages have been changed by people who came into contact with one another historically. That part of international law we actually have to own. We have to let go of the European legacy of it, go back to our common inheritance, because we have to be able as humans to give us laws that allow us to do well by one another. Right? That is not possible today. That's not possible today because of the way the world is organized, and also because of the political the material conditions of our lives is organized. And we end up always having to appear to be beggars. I told Professor Hines today that I worked briefly for the United Nations. I told you yesterday. I worked for something called, I was the director in Guinea of something called National Commission of Trade and Agreement. That National Commission of Trade and Agreement came from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development Conferences, right? And that is the conference that told us that we should have, that developing countries should be able to have access to technology to trade. The minute all of these countries, including Guinea, set up all these offices to be able to give us the technology to develop, America decided we need another round. And they had the Uruguay round. What came out of it? The first thing that came out of it was TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property, to bar us from having the technology to develop. And then they said they are from development. We said, no, don't give us stuff. Let's just acquire the technology. We'll do it ourselves. No. Because, right? So so the landscape of international law today has its own diplomatic strictures, to go back to the earlier question about diplomacy, which actually is about prevention for dependency. So we are eternally dependent. But we need a new system of international law which preceded the current systems. So we cannot let go of international law. We just have to let go of the legacy of Europe within it from 1492 to today and go back to the original script.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from one of our students.
Yeah.
Ramon?
Is that yours?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Question I have is, how would you assess black radicalism today, and do you see it initiating a challenge to the world order?
Pardon me, say that again?
How do you assess black radicalism today, and do you see it initiating a challenge to the world order?
Yes. Everything is a condition, our very condition. When I said black people have the best hymn, I didn't mean that we have it because we are black. It is because our condition in the modern world has shown us the face of the world that you need to see to be able to give a better world, because we have always been at the bottom, either as laborers, as people whose natural resources have to be taken, even their intellectual product, even things like digital banking, which Kenyans gave us, ended up somewhere else. It has always been, people have always taken from us. Our relationship has always been extractive. And that condition allows us to actually better understand how the mechanism of the international system operates. And we have always, whether it's in poetry, in literature, in law, in philosophy, we have always had the better perspectives. Except that in the manners in which disciplines are constituted, we cannot be heard. Give you one example. Every library in America, if you want to see books on Africa, you go to the section of library that is DT. Philosophy, anthropology, history is all there, because you are not in the philosophy section. You are in the Africa section. You are international lawyer, me, my book, at Cornell is DT. That's the code it's given. It's not in the law section. Right? It's not in the law section, but young Africans made it belong to the law section because they started a movement around the book, actually. So yes, the disciplines are the ones that occult what we do. It's not that we are not productive. It is that archives, right? Discipline are instruments, but they are not the only thing, but they depend on archives. They depend on canons. Canons are what part of what we write is worth looking at. And so when you say canon come from the church, it is that which is sanctioned. So we know which part of the books and which book we should read. That's how canons are constituted. And then archives are all the material out there. But we don't figure in the archives our voices are not in the canons, and so the disciplines can do without you. Right? I'll give you an example. Because I saw Confucius Center the other day, so this is a good time for me to say it. In the year 1911, the Chinese had their first revolution under Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was a Cantonese who studied with a bunch of Cantonese in France. And so he realized, studying in France, that if he wanted to recover, for China to recover from the unequal treaties, he needed the Chinese diaspora, those people who understand imperialism better. Sun Yat-sen chose as first his foreign minister and then later justice minister a diasporic Chinese from Trinidad, Eugene Bernard Acheng. He's the one who gave the Chinese the model for the first cultural magazines in Shanghai in 1920 and 1921. You know what those were modeled on? You can see C.L.R. James or C.L.R. James' teachers in those first editions of the cultural magazine. They're modeled on, on Pan-African thought as it came from people who resisted empire in Trinidad and in the place where we are sitting today. There's no revolution on this planet, modern, that didn't have, in some fashion, African thought in it. So when I went to Germany once and I said, look at Eugene Bernard Acheng, what does he look like? Some said, well, he kind of dark. I said, yeah. His mother is Venezuelan black. Yes, he's Chinese, yeah, ethnic Chinese, yeah, but his mother is Venezuelan black. Just look at the picture. And then my students tell me, oh, yeah. I said, yeah. Now go back to your cultural magazine and see the model of those magazines. We have been, so it's the way we canonize thought that makes all of those people fall apart. So people can learn about Eugene Bernard Acheng. He was first minister. He's the one who got Manchuria for the Chinese and etc. Nobody tells them where he came from. Nobody tells them about genealogy of thought. Nobody connects them to what was happening here in these islands, in the West Indies. But they took him from the West Indies. He was attached to these places. His sensibilities were anti-colonial, West Indian. What do you think he's going to bring to China? Right? So yes, it's the way those processes work that makes us marginal. But it's not that we actually have been, in fact, marginal, because we have never been marginal. We have always been central. But it's canonization, archiving, and indexing. It's all of those that push us to the side. But we have always been there.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, we have one at the front. We have a question at the front of the room.
Thank you, Baba Siba, for your presentation. It was truly enlightening. As a up-and-coming researcher, that is what I would call myself in this, in this forum, given who is in the room. My question to you, based on what you have been discussing and sharing with us, is how would you advise young researchers to give space to this concept of the spirit medium in light of how research is currently done? You spoke about the juxtaposition between subjectivity and objectivity, but from what I am hearing from you in terms of the spirit medium is those fleeting moments of consciousness and how those manifest in how we see international relations, the social sciences, and how we develop disciplines and its integration into those areas. So my question is, how would you advise young researchers to give space if you understand the spirit medium and the concept behind it in terms of its, what I would call consciousness, to inform what you are talking about in terms of how do we document and canonize our experiences as we go about trying to influence the world as we see it?
Thank you. One is to give students, the first one I would say is to give student models. And I think that I wanted to model. You see, I didn't even open my speech because when I saw the back there, one student, I decided that I have to make this, I have to pitch it differently. But it's to set models for them. Really. Number one. Number two is for us, ourselves, to model what we want students to see. So I'm a political scientist. I spent 3 years at University of Michigan and 22 years at Johns Hopkins University in political science. And one day I woke up and I said, I'm not going to write a book about black people sitting in the political science department. I'm going to Africana studies. Young blacks in the US fought in the 1960s to have a department like Africana studies, right? Because they intuitively understood that somewhere in the academy, our concerns, our lines of inquiries, our epistemologies, none of them figured in what people were doing in their discipline, so they needed these spaces. The student understood that. The teachers didn't for a long time. Because they thought that we go to Africana to be just the best literary figure, except we are located there. For many years, Africana Studies program were only historians. They have granted some time ago that we have histories. Literature, they have granted that too. Anthropology, well, they can study us, and etc. But there was no political scientists, no lawyers, no philosophers, no whatever. And that's what Cornell, as the original Africana Studies, is trying to change. And that's why I was invited to join them, and I said, I'm going to go. I think we have to give ourselves space. We have to give ourselves space to do that institutionally. But I also think that that is not enough. From those spaces, we have to challenge the canons, which is what basically this book project is. I'm sitting in Africana, but I want to challenge that. Right? I have never, ever made an apology. I go somewhere, and I say what I have to say, I go home. Right? But it matters, not to talk too much about myself, but I'm going to this time. The Turkish Academy of Science wanted somebody to go talk to them this year, and they invited me. I don't know why they invited me, but they invited me because somebody thought that there's something else, right? Turkey had occupied parts of Africa for some time. Algeria, Morocco, and etc., etc. But even the Turks don't know Africa that much. So all of a sudden, everybody is interested in Africa, which for me is an opportunity. Even the Russians have now allowed that Pushkin is the grandson of an African, the one who gave melody to the Russian language. The Chinese have discovered Zheng Yi, the merchant who came to the Swahili coast. You even have a statue of him in Kenya. So everybody now realizes that, and for all the wrong reasons, because now Africa is in a competition, everybody's competing over Africa and the Caribbean Isle. So now everybody have like their black people, which is good. I'm not begrudging it. But we use it as an opportunity to actually tell them what we actually think of the world, right? So there's no fixed trajectory. It's like the diplomacy I was talking about. We have to muddle through. But yes, consciousness is where we start. We first have to know that we belong. We have always belonged. And everybody who said not is lying to you. That's where we start.
Thank you. I can see Amisha's hand was up.
Yeah.
And this will be our last question for the night.
Good night. I just want to say thank you for such an engaging and intriguing lecture. me and my peers, we really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask, how can African political philosophy be applied to understanding international relations and systems of dependency in the global South and global North?
Whoa, say that again.
How can African political philosophy be applied to understanding international relations and systems of dependency in the global South and global North?
Thank you. Thank you. Africa has always been global. This conceit that globalization started in the 1990s obviously is bunk. Except to the New World, Africa is the one continent that was always connected to all the other continents. The Arab world, Muslim world, South Asia, obviously Europe to the Mediterranean, etc. Everything, all our systems, even our empires, Mali, Zimbabwe, all of them had not only had global connections, but they affected the world order. Mansa Musa, the third emperor of Mali, when he took gold from Mali and bring it to Egypt, he actually caused inflation and distortion in the global economy. You can actually read that on Google. Google still says that he's the richest man who ever lived. They still say it, even today, by today's measurement. So we have, and the thing is that we have always spoken as if we are asking for permission, right? This is the Sheikh and Tajab. You can quarrel with him a lot on the African origin of civilization. There's much to be quarreled with, including from me. But we should not underestimate how Africa was the center of everything that came to be. In philosophy, in mathematics, in physics, and etc. It has always been there. And so it's for us to start writing, not subjectively as, I'm from Barbados, I'm writing from Barbados. No. Hegel, I went to Tübingen in Germany to go see where this man who wrote the history of philosophy was sitting in the monastery in Tübingen. To just see, these people never left the 3 square feet of the earth that they inhabited, and they could talk about Africa. Africa saw everybody come and go, and we can talk about us and the world authoritatively. We have to gain not only authorship, but the authority to speak about the world, because we have been the world. I actually don't say that. It's not just, but and this is the last part for you all there, you cannot do that if you are glued to TikTok. If you are glued to TikTok and Wikipedia. You have to read. It took people centuries to give us the canons that you have in your disciplines. It's not going to take you one afternoon at the beach to find the correction to that. We actually have to know that's in audio talk. You see, when I spoke, I am the first person of African descent to be elected president of the ISA, this organization. And, well, I didn't say that. Thank you for the compliment. I didn't say that for that. But what I'm saying is that they know that I know everything, every reference they have. That I actually said without apologies to anybody. I know every single one of the references, but I know far more than they do. Because I also know my staff, and my staff they have no access to. So every time we meet, I get to be the teacher. I'm saying it, some of them will see online. I can say it because some of them have also said it. Yes. Yes, someone in the discipline who is UC Irvine once said that they gave me an honor at the association. She just said, you all know that this fellow here is a teacher for all of us. Because I do, and well, I don't have a life, so I read a lot. I'm a geek, right? But you have to love reading. You have to love discovering yourself. You have to. Nobody is going to give you your space under the sun unless you take it. Now, so you in the back that I'm talking, it's not going to be, we are, as people, getting out of the habit of reading what other people are reading to make artificial intelligence, coding, and we think that if we sit on the beach and look at TikTok, we are up to something.
Thank you.
Now that's Baba Siba speaking.
Thank you so much, Baba Siba. I think we can all agree that this was an intellectually stimulating lecture. It was beyond profound. Thank you for your enriching questions, and thank you for facilitating, Baba Siba. At this point, I think I would like to invite our research assistant, Alexandra Tillett, to present a little token of our appreciation. You can come back.
Thank you again for coming. Thank you, Mrs. Emmanuel. I'm really, really grateful. It was a surprise, and I'm happy that you came. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I will ask Dr. Broom to come and give the vote of thanks.
Wow. Good evening, Dr. Springer, Master of Mrs. of Ceremonies, members of the Diplomatic Corps. Before I continue, Professor, I met you yesterday. You were humanist before. Now you're a Christian. Yes, yes. A good Catholic. A Eurocentric religion, which would have helped to create that divide within a world society. True? The question was asked, how do you find space? You are at Cornell, a very prestigious university, but you're teaching PhDs, about 6. How do you move to the undergraduate to influence many of them to write? Because we've heard a lot this evening. We've read Diop, Rodney, C.L.R. James, etc. We know of the consciousness, etc. So we need to construct a program of change. How do you start that at Cornell with the undergrads, the largest group? That's something I think we need to think about, primarily because it is not for the lack of knowing. We've all been, I was taught Western political thought, black Athena 1, 2, white Athena writes back, all of them. And we're still back at square one. And we have a republic in Barbados, highly questionable. So therefore, yes, no. But I wish to thank you and Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal, UWI, K-Phil Campus, the deans, deputy deans, heads of department of the UE, and our own Dr. Christina Hines. And I wish to thank also Ms. June Emmanuel, family and friends of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, and your family and friends here, as well as the wider UE community, and of course, the Honorable Professor Eugene Bartow for gracing us this evening. It is always an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this event hosted by the Department of Government Sociology and Social Work. Please engage me, primarily because last year I left off 2 names and I heard it for 6 weeks afterwards. So I can't go with protocol dispensed. I have to spend it. So on behalf of the department, through the executive management of the University of the West Indies, Cayfield campus, represented here by our Deputy Principal, Winston Moore, we owe a debt of gratitude to the Emmanuel family for giving us the privilege and honor of naming this distinguished lecture series in his memory. Saying thank you is a reverential way of showing appreciation towards a person, and so Mr. Emmanuel, Shea Emmanuel, the university continues to commend your family for graciously consenting through you for setting the stage with personal reflections of your beloved uncle, and for us here at the UWI to think on the life of a distinguished Grenadian, the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel. Additionally, we respectfully accept the kind regards conveyed to us by Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal of the UWI Cayfield campus, and those from the Dean and colleagues of the Faculty of Social Sciences. As always, every year, a planning committee formalizes the preparations for the realization of this lecture. And so we have to thank our colleagues for enabling a calm and thoughtful approach towards seeing the reality of this evening. So we give thanks to Ms. Teresita Cox, the acting admin assistant, and Ms. Alexandra Tillett, our research assistant. Both must be accorded our depth of gratitude for their unwavering support in coordinating and fine-tuning all the administrative details. Dr. Hines and Dr. Springs and myself, we continue to provide the supporting roles in coordinating the lecture series and ensuring that Professor Seba gets here on time. Dr. Sprer, I wish to thank you for chairing this meeting, and to you, Dr. Hines, for your spirited introduction in presenting Professor Seba. He said to call him that yesterday at lunch, so I thank you. And by extension, the department extends its heartfelt gratitude to the heads of UWITV and the Earl Barr Center for Creative Imagination in willingly providing the requisite support and services. Because of UWITV, this event is being streamed throughout the region and beyond, giving an opportunity for Professor Seba's thoughts to be heard and ruminated upon, and we need longer than 9 o'clock. Give us 9:15. For sure, we must also not forget the campus lecture series for providing complementary funding for this event to take place. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be failing in my duty if I did not thank the Grenada Students Association, who were instrumental in providing us with Ms. Grace Niles, with her intuitive spoken word presentation. To the student volunteers who facilitated the question and answer session, the department is grateful for your supporting roles this evening. The importance of this event is underlined by the presence of Baba, Professor Seba Zatuli Grufagui. Ladies and gentlemen, our lecture series always commences with the breaking of bread. And so yesterday, when we met at lunch, Professor Seba provided thoughtful insights of the internal and existential threats to Africa and its larger diaspora, inclusive of the Caribbean communities, and what they continue to face. His comprehensive yet in-depth knowledge offered vignettes yesterday that we look forward to hearing from him today, which he has elaborated on in his spirit medium on the Hudson. An irony, since humanists don't believe in the spirit world. But bifurcation of thought. Anyway, we can all concur that he did not disappoint us this evening in delivering a powerful, thought-provoking lecture like the expert speaker that he is, interspersed with his witty and fond recollections with examples and analogies. Since its inception, the Pat Emmanuel Lecture continues to host speakers who display creativity and innovation of thought by offering interesting new interpretations of our developmental challenges, but equally proffering solutions of hope for taking the story of transformational development forward. Professor, we thank you for agreeing to deliver this year's lecture, and we hope you'll come back for part 2. Remember, it's an 800-page volume you're writing, so there's a lot to be said. Finally, the department expresses its appreciation to you, our guest, for gracing this occasion and being with us on this special evening to commemorate and celebrate the legacy of the Venerable Dr. Pat Emmanuel by continuing his legacy by the presence of scholars of excellence. I am sure he would have appreciated in his company to interpret and reinterpret his original perspective for developmental transformation. Because of your presence, the family, department, faculty, and the university remains motivated and encouraged to celebrate the intellect of a regional son of the soil. We've reached the end, and I'm told we have to thank our colleague, Dr. Alana Griffith, for the floral arrangement. Yes. And refreshments, we have to thank the Lanique Catering Service for putting them on, and they will be available as we leave. So, to everyone, our sincerest thanks, deep appreciation for coming this evening, and on behalf of the department, the Faculty of Social Sciences, the university, thank you once more, and we move forward to the 20th edition of the Pat Emmanuel Lecture. Good night. All the best. Thank you.